Okay, I'll spend half an hour looking for my pen. Now that I have my pen, I can do this. You're finding the slope of a line, right? The steepness of a line. And in order to do that, you can take any 2 points, okay, on the line, any 2 points. And obviously, because we're limited somehow, right, with the values here, we want to take a point that we can actually know the location. You wouldn't take this point, for example, because we don't know exactly where it is, okay, value-wise. That looks like 2.5, negative 2.5, and 0.6 on the y. So we're not going to look. You don't use those values. Obviously, use the values that are points that are on the intersection. So keeping that in mind, they were kind enough to give us these 2 points. So let's do number 1, and we have 2 points. The first point, and I'll call this A and call this B. Point A is -1 and -1. Point B is 2, -2. Okay, 2 to the right and 2 down. Now, what you're really doing, if you think about this is the vertical distance. This is what you're doing. This is the y2 minus y1. And then you're going to measure this. This, you're measuring x2 minus x1. The distance between those 2 points, right, on the x-axis, right here. And this is the distance between. So if I make that a little bigger, right? So you're measuring this distance over here, and this is the y2 minus y1. And this distance going horizontally is your x2 minus x1, right? You're subtracting this point on the x-axis minus this point on the x-axis, and then you're subtracting this point on the y-axis minus this point on the y-axis. So that's what we're doing. So that's why they call it rise over run. So this, the rise, the ratio of the rise over the run, which is your horizontal line. All right, so next thing I asked you to do was label this. Call this the x-coordinate and the y-coordinate, the x-coordinate, y-coordinate. And then we have to establish which one you want to be the 1s and which one you want to be the 2s. So let's call this x1, y1. And this will be your x2, y2. Now, makes life much easier, right? So you're going to subtract the y values, right? And then you subtract the x values. So the y values are these two, this guy over here and this guy over here. Except that this one, so it's y2, which is -2, minus y1, which is -1, I'll put that in parentheses, over these two values. I'll put it in blue. This guy and this guy here. So it's 2 minus -1. Now, before I even process this, I'm looking at this slope. The slope is going down from left to right. So we know my answer is going to be negative something, right? So I know because it's decreasing. So on the top, -2 minus -1 is the same thing as -2 plus 1, which gives me -1. On the bottom is 2 minus -1, which is the same thing as 2 plus 1, which is 3. So the slope of this line is -1 over 3. And we'll talk about this more in detail, what that means. But that's pretty much what I want you to do today. Let's look at 3, because you're supposed to be doing the odd numbers. So again, let me draw this out. These 2 points, right? So these 2 points, let's talk about this guy right here, right? What is the height, right? Think about, I guess you can call it height. What's that difference there? How much does that measure? Now, if I were to count, and let me put a dot here, this rise, right? It's the difference between y values. So if you were to count, you can even count this. You can say, well, it's 1, 2, 3. So the rise is 3. Going up and down is 3. Going left to right, what's the distance between those 2 points? Well, it's 1, 2 units. So slope, again, is the change in the y values, so the rise, right, over the run. But it's going to be negative because, again, it's decreasing, so it's -3 over 2. This is a different way. So let me do this, okay, the way We did it in class. So that's the cheating way, the super easy way. Now, if we're doing it the way we did in class, we're going to use or subtract the y values, and then we subtract the x values. First, we got to find the points. Let's call this point C and point D. Point C is 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, negative 4, and 0. Point D is negative 2 and 3 down, negative 3. The second thing we do is we call this x, and we call this y, we call this x, and we call this y. So you got to make a decision. Doesn't matter. Let's call this x1, y1, and let's call this x2, y2. Now that we know who's who, right? x1 is negative 4, y1 is 0, x2 is negative 2, y2 is negative 3. Let's plug it in here. So y2, negative 3, minus y1, which is 0, over x2, which is negative 2, minus negative 4. Let's see what we get. On the top, negative 3 minus 0 is just negative 3. On the bottom, negative 2 minus negative 4 is positive 2. Look, I got the same answer doing it this way and doing it this way. You can just simply count if you wanted to. Why don't we do it that way? Well, because it's not always available for you to count. All right, because sometimes you're not going to get a graph, you're going to get 2 points. And let's call this point E and F. All right, so let's say you have point E and F, and let's call point E. Let's figure out what point E is. Point E is negative 1 and 2 up. Point F is 1, 2, 3, 4, negative 4. And how many down? 1, 2, 3, negative 3. And if we were to do this using this, right, finding the slope, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. First, we got to figure out who's who. Let's take a moment to label this. This is my x and y. My x and y. Who are my 1s and who are my 2s? Doesn't matter. I'm going to make this my... Sorry, you know what? Let's make these guys my 1s. And these guys my 2s. So x2 is negative 1. Y2 is 2. x1 is negative 4. And y1 is negative 3. So we know who's who. Let's just plug them in. So y2 is 2. Minus y1, which is right here, negative 3. X2 is negative 1, minus x1, which is negative 4. If you look at the graph, the line, the slope is going up from left to right, so it's increasing. So therefore, my answer is going to be positive. So whatever we do here must be positive. Negative 2 minus negative 3 is 5. And negative 1 minus negative 4 is 3. So the slope of this line is 5 over 3. Now, let me do it counting. Okay, so imagine, right, so if I didn't give you this graph and I gave you this and this, you're probably going to do what I just did. But what if you got the graph? Can you count? Well, so I want to find the height. So if you think about this, you can even make a little triangle here. So there's this line. Right? This line right here. Right? That's the height. Right? That's the difference in y value. So if I subtract, right? So think about it. This is where negative 2 is on the y-axis, and this is negative 4 is on my axis, y-axis. If I told you to count the distance, find the distance between these 2 points, well, you'd say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the difference between the y coordinates, the difference, I'll write the difference. The y coordinates is 5 over the difference, the change in x in the x on the x-axis. So on the x-axis, you have a point here, right? Because that the horizontal distance. So you have 1, 2, 3, 5 over 3, and notice that we get the same exact answer. Seven. Why is it 7? I think it's 5. No, did I skip 3? I don't think I skipped 3. Oh, I think 7. Well, 7. Again, let's find the point. Let's call this x. No, sorry, let's not call it x. Let's call this k. Let's call this p. Point k is 1, 2. Point p is 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 4. 3, negative 4. Point P. My x and y, my x and y. Let's make this x1, y1. let's make this x2, y2. So now you know who's who, right? x1 is 1, y1 is 2, x2 is 3, and this guy, y2, is -4. Now it's just a matter of plugging it in, right? So you're finding this. So the first thing we're doing is counting from this point all the way here, right? That's the height. So think of a triangle, you know, making a triangle. What's the height? What's this measurement over here? Well, in order to do that, we're going to subtract the y value. So remember, I'll write it over here. y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1. So y2 is -4 minus y1, which is 2, over x2, which is 3, minus x1, which is 1. So we should get a negative number. On top, -4 minus 2 is -6, and 3 minus 1 is 2. If you simplify, you get -3. So the ratio, right, we're comparing two numbers here, the ratio of the distance between the x, the difference between the x coordinates and the difference between the the difference between the y coordinates and the difference between the x coordinate is -3. And actually, it's -3 over 1. Okay. Now this one, you don't have the graph, so we can't cheat and just count. So actually here we have to do x1, y1, and therefore this would be x2, y2, and if you did it backwards, that's completely fine. You get the same exact answer because you're finding the difference between the two coordinate points. Okay, so maybe I should leave this here. Slope, y2 minus y1, x2 over x1. Y2 is 14, y1 is 10, x2 is -7 minus x1, which is 8. So we get 14 minus 10 is 4, 4 over -15. So that's the slope for number 9. Number 11. Again, x and y. This will be my x1, y1. This would be my, this would be my x2, y2. Plug it in. M equals y2, which is -10, minus y1, which is -4. x2, which is -12, minus x1, which is -20. -10 minus -4 is the same thing as -10 plus 4, which is -6. -12 minus -20 is the same thing as -12 plus 20, which is +8. Simplify that, we get -3 over 4. And if you were to graph this, it would look like a line going down because it's a negative slope. Okay? -9. Okay. X and Y. X and Y. I'm going to make this the 2's. And this is going to be my x1, y1. So you know who everybody is. Put it in your slope formula. y2, which is -6, minus y1, which is 16, over x2, which is -19, minus 15, x1, which is -15. On the top, we get -22. At the bottom, we get -34. You can simplify this as a negative divided by a negative, and we get 11 over 17. That should have been your final answer. $15, and last problem. Wow, this was way too little. Again, m equals, so let's find the difference between the y values and then the difference between the x values. So let me call this x and y. Let me call this x and y. This is going to be my x1, y1, only because I chose it to be. If you want it the other way, you can do it the other way. This is going to be my x2, y2. So, y2 is -15, y1 is -20, over x2, -18, minus x1, which is -18 as well. Okay. -15 plus, it's going to be plus 20. It's going to give you 5 over -18 minus -18, which is going to give you 0. So remember what we said was this? 5 minus 0. is going to be undefined. And if you were to graph this, this would be, this is your x and y, right? This line looks like this. This line looks like this. Let's pretend this is negative 18. One dot is over here, one dot is over here, and that's your line. It's a line like that, and obviously the slope is undefined. That's it.